Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Sorry, messed up that order there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever time you're listening. Welcome to the American Reckoning podcast, where faith leads, history speaks, and truth and light will endure. Today is March 20th, 2026. This is part two of episode two. We'll cover the expansion of the U.S. military power from 2001 to present by four different presidential administrations, the growing dysfunctional partisan hypocrisy in Congress, and what both the president and Congress owe the American people. This is a hard-hitting segment of this episode, the one you'll likely would never hear in a high school classroom. Again, it's extremely blunt and critical, but it's very, very grounded in history. And it's factual. You want receipts, research? I got them. So let's begin. So by the time the United States entered the 21st century, the U.S. military force without formal declarations, the use of military force without formal declarations of war had already become common. But after September 11, 2001, that authority expanded dramatically. On September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked. Nearly 3,000 Americans were killed. Within days, Congress acted. September 14, 2001, Congress passed authorization for the use of military force, also known as the AUMF. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one member, Barbara Lee, Democrat, voted against it. That authorization allowed the president to use force against those responsible for the attacks and those who harbored or supported them. At the time, the focus seemed to be clear: Al-Qaeda, the Taliban in Afghanistan. But the language was broad. No geographical limits, no expiration date, and no precise definition of associated forces. And that mattered. Because over time, that authority was applied far beyond its original scope by President Bush and the next three presidents. Under George W. Bush, or Jr., the United States launched the war in Afghanistan in 2001, and later the invasion of Iraq in 2003, supported by a separate authorization but tied to the broader post 9/11 framework. Under Barack Obama, the U.S. dramatically expanded drone strike operations in countries like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. In 2011, again underneath Obama, the United States participated in military operations in Libya, conducting airstrikes as part of a NATO-led intervention during the Arab Spring without explicit congressional authorization. This operation effectively took out Gaddafi and since then has left Libya an unstable quagmire. Began in 2014, the U.S. initiated military operations against ISIS in Iraq, Syria, citing the existing AUMF. That period, underneath Obama, raised additional legal and constitutional questions. Most notably, the use of drone strikes against individuals identified as terroristic threats included U.S. citizens operating overseas, such as Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen in 2011, who was an American citizen. The administration justified those actions as part of an ongoing counterterrorism operation under existing authority, but they generated significant debate over due process because you had an American citizen, executive power, and the limits of wartime authority. Under Donald Trump's first administration, the U.S. continued counterterrorism operations across multiple regions. And in 2020, during the Trump administration, conducted a strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, raising immediate questions about congressional authorization and war powers. Under Joe Biden, U.S. forces continued operations against ISIS and other groups, underneath the existing authorizations. And it carried out strikes in Syria and Iraq in response to attacks on U.S. personnel. Across all these administrations, Republican and Democrat, the same pattern continued. Military force was used across multiple countries over many years without new, specific declarations of war tied to each operation. So while Congress had authorized force in 2001, the way that authority was applied expanded significantly over time, and that expansion raised new concerns because the question was no longer just should the president be able to act quickly in a crisis. The question became how long can that authority last and how far can it be stretched? And that brings us back to where we are today because the framework created in 1964, in 1973, and after 9/11 is what is being used today. As we bring it back to present, there's another reality that has to be addressed. The debate over war powers is not just about the Constitution. It's about how Congress actually behaves. And the truth is, over the past 2 decades, what we see repeatedly is a pattern, one that at times rises to the level of, dare I say, hypocrisy. Members of Congress routinely invoke the Constitution, but too often only when it is politically convenient. When a president from their own party uses military force, they defend it. When a president from the opposing party does the same, those same lawmakers that supported their president are far more likely to raise constitutional objections. This is not consistent application of principle. It is partisan political games. After 9/11, both parties overwhelmingly supported the expanded military authority under George H.W. Bush. But as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on, Democrats increasingly raised concerns about executive overreach and legality. Then the White House changed hands. Under Barack Obama, military operations expanded in Libya, drone campaigns intensified, and the fight against ISIS began. Republicans did raise constitutional concerns in some cases, particularly around Libya and executive authority, but more often Republicans criticism focused on strategy and strength, arguing that the Obama administration was not being aggressive enough and not declaring clear objectives or failing to follow through. Then, underneath the Donald Trump during his first term, when military force was used, including actions involving Iran, most Republicans supported the authority of the president to act, while Democrats raised constitutional objections and demanded congressional approval. Then, under Joe Biden, military operations continued under the same legal framework. Republicans largely supported the use of force in principle, but frequently criticized Biden's administration's execution, deterrence posture, and strategic clarity. At the same time, Democrats continue to be largely supportive of Biden. And now, with Donald Trump back in office, the United States is actively engaged in conflict involving Iran. The pattern has repeated once again. Many Republicans are backing the administration's actions. Many Democrats are raising constitutional objections. So let's be clear. The Constitution hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is which party holds power in the White House. And these partisan political games should concern every American. Because war is not a talking point. It is not a campaign issue. It is not a political weapon. It is the most serious decision a nation can make. And yet, too often, responsibility is passed back and forth between the branches of government and the political parties. Presidents act, sometimes stretching existing authority, and Congress responds after the fact. Congress criticizes, raises constitutional concerns, and often points fingers, but often stops short of taking decisive action to assert its authority. And in that space, accountability gets blurred, responsibility gets diluted, and the American people are left trying to sort out who is actually accountable for the decisions of war. Now, to be fair, there also are a small number of lawmakers who have refused to follow that pattern, who have taken the same position, regardless of party. A handful of them. Democrat uh, Barbara Lee, Bernie Sanders, Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Dennis Kucinich, Walter Jones, Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, Ro Khanna, and Tim Kaine. These lawmakers don't agree on most issues, but on those between that mixture of Republicans and Democrats, they're pretty much have always remained consistent. And they're often part of the fringe elements of their party. But what they have shown is something that should be standard: consistency. And that consistency stands in contrast to the broader pattern of the behavior in Congress, where the most serious decision a nation can make, a decision to send Americans into harm's way, is too often filtered through politics first and principle second. So this is not just a historical observation. This is a call to both branches of government, to both political parties. To the president, need to clearly define the mission, the legal authority, and the objectives before committing American forces. To Congress, to stop reacting after the fact, to debate, to vote, and to take ownership for the decisions and stop playing political hyper-partisan games. Because if both parties and branches continue to shift responsibility back and forth, then accountability disappears. And when accountability disappears, trust dissolves. And that's what has happened the last 25 years. We've walked through history from the Constitution to Vietnam, to the War Powers Resolution of 1973, to the expansion of executive authority after 9/11, and to the role the Congress has played consistently and inconsistently along the way. And all that brings us to where we are right now, because this is not theoretical. The United States is actively engaged in conflict in Iran. It is a war. American forces are deployed across the region on Navy vessels and the Gulf, on bases in Iraq and Syria and throughout the region, and in positions where escalation isn't just possible, but it's already underway. This is not a debate about whether we might go to war. We're in it. And that reality raises immediate questions, not just about about strategy, but about authority, accountability, and the truth. Because over the past several days, Americans have heard different explanations from Donald Trump, members of his administration, and congressional Republicans as to why the United States acted. Some statements have focused on protecting American forces in the region, supporting an ally, Israel, already moving toward military action, preventing Iran from advancing its nuclear capabilities, targeting their vast missile system and military infrastructure, reported past threats and plots attributed to the Iranian government against U.S. leadership, and in some cases, broader suggestions about weakening or changing the Iranian regime. Those are not small differences. They're fundamentally different justifications. And when the reasoning shifts, it raises questions. What is the actual objective? Because without clearly defined objectives, it becomes very difficult to define success. And without a definition of success, it becomes very difficult to determine how long a conflict should last, what the level of risk is acceptable, and what the end state is supposed to be. That uncertainty matters because the American people have seen this before. They remember Vietnam. They remember the justifications for entering Iraq in 2003. And today, both Americans, even some U.S. allies, are asking whether this is a war of necessity or a war of choice. The American people deserve a clear explanation for why we're at war now, and they have every right to be skeptical because that skepticism is rooted in experience. Intelligence failures that contributed to the escalation of Vietnam, the WMD claims that led to the Iraq War, and the reality that the United States lost the war in Afghanistan after more than 2 decades. That history shapes trust. And right now, there is a significant lack of trust among Americans when it comes to the use of military power, especially in the context of the last 25 years. The cost has been high. Approximately 4,500 U.S. servicemen and women were killed in Iraq, with over 32,000 wounded. Approximately 2,400 were killed in Afghanistan, with more than 20,000 wounded. And beyond those numbers, there are long-term consequences. Veterans living with physical injuries, mental health challenges, including PTSD, illnesses linked to burn pits and toxic exposure. Financially, the cost has been staggering. Roughly 2 to 3 trillion spent in Iraq, roughly 2.3 trillion spent in Afghanistan. And when the long-term obligations like veterans care are included, some independent studies estimate the total cost of post 9/11 wars rises to about 8 trillion. And it's important to say clearly, without qualification, American service men and women did not fail on the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan. They carried out their missions. They won engagements. They adapted. They executed some of the most complex military operations in modern history with discipline, courage, and effectiveness. From Fallujah to Kandahar to countless operations that will never make headlines. They did what was asked of them. They performed. But winning battles is not the same as winning a war. And in both Iraq and Afghanistan, the failure was not tactical on the ground level. It was a strategic failure by the leadership that was often not on the ground, not on the squad level, not at the platoon level, not by the men and women carrying out the mission, but on the level of senior civilian military leadership, senior military leadership, and the political leadership in Washington, D.C. Over the past 25 years, those decisions have spanned 4 presidential administrations, 13 different Congresses. During that time, Republicans held full control of the government. I'm talking House and Senate 5 times. Democrats held full control, both the House and Senate, 3 times. And the government was divided between the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, 5 times. So responsibility does not belong to one party. It does not belong to one president. It belongs to an entire system of leadership that over time failed to define clear objectives, failed to align strategy with reality, and failed to level with the American people about how the war was actually going. And that's not speculation. That's documented. And what became known as the Afghan Papers, also referred to as Lesson Learned Report, senior officials, military leaders, and policymakers later acknowledged something deeply troubling, that the American people were not consistently told the truth about how the war was going on in Afghanistan, that progress was often overstated, that objectives were unclear and constantly changing, and that there is no unified understanding of what victory actually meant. Those are not minor issues. Those are foundational failures. And once that level of trust is broken, it doesn't reset easily. So when Americans hear new justifications for war, they don't hear them in isolation. They hear them through the lens of the last two decades. Now, it's true that modern conflicts move faster than the founders could have imagined. Decisions might need to be made quickly. Intelligence might be time sensitive. Allies may act on their own timeliness, and threats to American forces may be immediate. But those realities do not reduce the responsibility of leadership. They increase it because faster decisions are made, the more important it is those decisions are explained clearly afterward, not in fragments, not in shifting language, but in a way the American people can understand. Because clarity is not optional in a republic, it's required. So that brings us to the central issue in this moment. Not just whether the United States should be involved in this conflict, but whether the decision to be involved and the way the decision was made meets the standard of the Constitution was designed to uphold. And that's where we're going to focus on next, because this is no longer just history, it's happening right now. Before we analyze decisions being made right now, we need to back up and understand something clearly. This conflict did not begin this month. It did not begin this year. It goes back 4 decades to 1979. After Iranian Revolution, militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held American hostages for 444 days. That moment reshaped the U.S.-Iran relations, and they never fully recovered. Now, let me be clear. What I'm about to say is not an argument for war, nor is it an argument against war. This is offering context, because without understanding the history, you cannot understand the present. Since 1979, Iran has built a strategy centered around proxy warfare, supporting armed groups across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen. These groups have carried out attacks against Israel, U.S. forces, regional allies, and civilians. For Israel, Iran's just not a rival, isn't just a rival. It is a direct and ongoing threat. Through its proxies, Iran has enabled attacks responsible for thousands of Israeli deaths over decades. This is a sustained conflict, not a recent development. For the United States, the threat has been real. 241 U.S. Marines were killed in Beirut in 1983. At least 603 U.S. service men and women have been killed by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. More than 1,000 Americans killed by Iranian proxies over the past 2 decades. That is not indirect tension. That is a direct impact on American lives. Across the Middle East, Iranian-backed groups have contributed to tens of thousands of deaths in conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Entire regions destabilized, millions displaced. And this threat isn't just confined to the region. European intelligence agencies have disrupted assassination plots, attacks on dissidents, threats targeting Israeli and Jewish institutions. Iran's reach is global. But there's another part of the story. What the Iranian government has done to its own people. Protests have repeatedly been met with deadly force. More recently, additional crackdowns have resulted in the reports of mass civilian casualties, uh, with figures going up to about 35,000. These civilians were not combatants. But alongside that, for decades, state-sponsored rallies have included the chants of "Death to America, Death to Israel." Those slogans reflect a deep ideology that has shaped Iran's posture towards the United States, Israel, and the West. And it's important to understand this as well. Concern about Iran is not limited to one political party or one president. Every administration since 1979 has identified Iran through different language and different strategies as Iran being a significant challenge. Jimmy Carter responded to the hostage crisis by freezing Iranian assets and imposing sanctions. Ronald Reagan confronted Iranian-backed activity in Lebanon, even as his administration was later tied to the Iran-Contra scandal. George H.W. Bush warned Iran over its support for terrorism while signaling limited openness to improve relations. Ironically, under Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush as his vice president, we were actually supporting Saddam Hussein in Iraq in the 80s and helping arm Iraq to fight Iran. Bill Clinton formally labeled Iran a state sponsor of terrorism and expanded economic sanctions. George W. Bush, or Jr., placed Iran as in the axis of evil, citing terrorism and weapons concerns. Barack Obama pursued diplomacy through nuclear agreement while acknowledging Iran's continued support for terrorist proxy groups. Donald Trump withdrew from that agreement, called it flawed, and implemented maximum pressure campaign during his last administration. Joe Biden attempted to revive those negotiations while maintaining pressure on Iran's regional activities. Different approaches, different language, but a consistent, tough line. Iran has been viewed across administrations as a persistent strategic problem. And when that level of consistency spans for 4 decades and both parties, it tells you that this is not a new problem. So when policymakers describe Iran as a threat, they're pointing to a pattern: hostage taking, proxy warfare, terrorism, attacks on U.S. forces, sustained threats against Israel, regional instability, internal repression, and activity extending to Europe and beyond. Is Iran a regional threat in the Middle East and to our allies? Israel? To Americans and American interests in the area? No doubt. Was Iran an imminent threat to the U.S. mainland? That I'm not convinced of, and I'm not sure most Americans by most polls are as well. Currently, this is just looking at the polls today. When you break it into thirds, about 8 and 10 Democrats are against the war, 6 and 10 independents are against the war, 8 and 10 Republicans are supportive. If you're to kind of combine all that, a little bit over half Americans are against the war. It's mostly along party ideology. Independents are kind of in the middle, um, but slightly sway the polls. But again, acknowledging that pattern is not the same thing as justifying war. It does not answer whether this conflict is necessary. It doesn't answer whether the timing was right. And it does not remove the responsibility of leadership to explain their decisions. But all this information does, as far as regarding Iran, it provides context. Because if you ignore history, you miss a critical part of the picture. And that's what brings us to the next question. If this threat is real, if this pattern is long standing, then why didn't we act then and why are we acting now? Was it defense? Was it strategy or is it something else? Before we move forward, there's another question that has to be confronted directly. Because once you understand history and once you have an understanding of the threat, you're left with a very specific issue. Why this happened and when it did, as far as this escalation, this war. Before getting into the statements, I want to add a personal observation. I was stationed in Europe in 2002 to 2003, leading up to Operation Iraqi Freedom. And from where we stood, there is no ambiguity about what was coming. We could see the buildup, the equipment, the hardware, the personnel flowing in, the ordnance, and logistics ramping up. Even as George W. Bush Jr. administration was publicly discussing diplomacy, many of us understood what that level of mobilization meant. We were going to war. And watching the past few weeks unfold from Texas, I kind of had that feeling again over the last month. And I don't think I was alone. A lot of Americans and people around the world could sense it, not necessarily knowing exactly what day, but knowing that the trajectory for war was already set. That brings us to what U.S. leaders had to say very shortly after the war began. On March 2nd, 2026, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, "We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them, Iran, we would suffer high casualties." That same day, after a classified briefing, Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, Republican, said Israel was prepared to act with or without American support, and that Iranian retaliation would have likely targeted U.S. forces across the region had we not acted. If those statements are accurate, then the United States may have been facing a very specific dilemma. Either we sit back and watch Israel attack and put thousands of our men and women in imminent danger of a Iranian counterstrike, or we join the attack and prevent a potential large loss of life. I want to be honest with you. My initial reaction when I heard those statements was anger. I thought, how dare Israel put our political and military leadership in that dilemma? How dare they undermine our political process and deny our leadership and the American people a chance to prepare for war? But then another possibility has to be considered. Was this also about timing, about intelligence, about a narrow window that decision makers believed would not last? On March 1st, 2026, Reuters reported that the speed of the opening phase of the conflict may have been driven by intelligence gathered by Israel and the United States, pointing to a potential opportunity to decapitate key Iranian civilian and military leadership before those targets could disperse and go underground. So that brings us to the core question. Why did the United States act when it did? Was it primarily to protect American forces from imminent retaliation, basically being coerced by Israel, or an agreement by both the U.S. and Israeli uh, governments to accelerate a strategy aimed at crippling Iran's leadership and potentially ending the conflict sooner? Because those are not the same justifications. One is forced protection by coercion. The other is a joint strategic decision by both Israel and the U.S. to escalate. And if those explanations are being blended together, then the American people have every right to demand clarity, because this cannot become another shifting narrative. If Rubio and Johnson are correct, then the administration should produce the evidence, show the intelligence, show the timeline, show what was communicated between U.S. and Israel, show what threats were assessed to be imminent. Because if this was about preventing American casualties slash coercion, that matters. This was about seizing a narrow strategic opportunity, that also matters. But if those explanations are being used interchangeably at the beginning of this conflict, Without transparency, trust erodes, like during and after Vietnam, after Iraq, after Afghanistan. The American people are entitled to more than just assertions. They're entitled to evidence. And that brings us to the next question. Where does this go from here? If the United States is already at war in all practical terms, then the issue is no longer just why we acted. It's what comes next. Does this remain an air and sea campaign? Do we continue missile strikes and bombing runs for weeks or months or years like we did in Iraq in the 90s? And after not Operation Iraqi Freedom, after the Persian Gulf War, for the next 8 years or almost 10 years, we continue to have the U.S. Navy and assets deployed in the region, sitting there bombing, Saddam and enforcing a no-fly zone. Are we looking at doing that? Or does this escalate to ground involvement? The question matters even more now because U.S. military has reportedly moved roughly about 2,500 Marines and three amphibious ships towards the region with elements of the 31st Marine Expedition Unit. That does not mean a ground invasion is imminent, but it does mean the range of options, military options, is expanding. And that leads to a central issue. What is the objective? Because if the goal is regime collapse, air power alone may not be enough. Recent reporting indicates Iran's leadership, even though they are systematically being taken out, still remains in control. There is no clear evidence, at least publicly, of an imminent collapse. You have to understand how Iran is controlled. Their provincial and local governments, police and militia, tightly control the population through terror. Most of that population is unarmed. Believe it or not, only about an estimated 20 to 30% of Iran's form of Shiite Islam is practiced in the country. But yet, that 20 to 30% of the population controls the other 70 to 80% of the population ruthlessly and has done so very effectively for the last 47 years. Imagine in the U.S. here, if between your police department, your state police, your National Guard, they are enforcing a specific way of life, a very strict and clamp down ruthlessly, very much like Iran does. That is the framework of Iranian civilization. Not to mention they have a surveillance state that far exceeds even what the U.S. has. So the next question becomes, are ground forces needed to take out that local control? There's been reporting about Kurdish groups as potential pressure point. Now, to be clear, the Kurds are not an untested force. They are a battle-hardened people. For decades, Kurdish fighters, often referred to as the Peshmerga, and I apologize about the probably mispronunciation of that, have fought to survive against multiple adversaries. Saddam Hussein's forces in Iraq, the Turkish military, Iranian security forces along their borders, and more recently, Kurdish forces have played a significant role in fighting ISIS alongside U.S. forces in Iraq. So, yes, they are capable, they're experienced, they're resilient, but capability alone is not enough because what they've been fighting is not the same way what they'd be asked to do here in Iran. Fighting an insurgency, holding fragmented territory is very different than toppling a centralized state like Iran. Recent intelligence assessments have raised doubts about whether the Kurdish groups have the numbers and coordination or firepower to sustain that kind of fight. And that matters because if the theory is internal collapse, then you run to a basic reality. Iran is not a broadly armed civilian society. There is no evidence of a population ready to suddenly rise up and take on an entrenched security state. And even if weapons were supplied, you cannot simply drop equipment into a country and expect civilians, many with little or no military or weapons training, to overthrow a centralized system of control. That's not strategy, that's suicide. There's another reality that can't be ignored: the size and geography of Iran. That's overlooked. Iran is massive. It covers about 1.6 million square kilometers, roughly about 2.5 times the size of Texas, about the size of Alaska in scale, and is about 1/6 of the size of the United States. And it's not just large, it's very difficult terrain. Iran is dominated by rugged mountain ranges, multiple of them, high plateaus, deserts, narrow valleys. That terrain complicates military movements, supply lines, air-ground coordination, and long-term control of territory. So when we talk about the Kurdish forces, internal uprisings, or potential U.S. ground involvement, we're talking about a country that is vast in size, rugged in territory, and governed by a very entrenched system. There is no simple path forward. To say otherwise is not to understand the geography, the history, or the culture. The same mistakes made in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And even as strikes continue to degrade Iran's military capabilities, there's another issue: sustainment. Iran retains the ability to regenerate its capability through cheap drones, missiles, and asymmetric warfare. And again, to do it cheaply. And even if the U.S. and Israel take out most of Iran's military industrial complex, there is also an active trade corridor through the Caspian Sea connecting Iran to Russia. Now, I encourage y'all to pull up a map of Iran. The U.S. Navy cannot simply move into the Caspian Sea. There's no direct route. Public reporting confirms that that route still remains open. While there is no definitive public evidence that weapons are currently moving through that corridor, it represents a potential line of sustainment that cannot be ignored. If this conflict should last, what is U.S. and Israel's goal to close that logistics route between Iran and Russia? And then there's Russia. Russia has clear incentives in this conflict. The United States has spent years supplying Ukraine with intelligence that target Russian assets, weapons, tens of billions of dollars in financial support, and that has placed Washington and Moscow on opposing sides of an active war. So any conflict that pulls U.S. focus and military attention elsewhere benefits Russia strategically. There's also credible reporting that Russia may be actively supporting Iran. U.S. Officials have stated that Russia has provided intelligence that could assist Iran in targeting American military assets, including our naval forces and bases in the region. Russia denies those claims. What is not disputed is a broader relationship. Russia and Iran have established a military partnership. Russia has used Iranian-made drones in Ukraine, and Iran continues to deploy those same systems in the Middle East. And then there's the economic layer. Among rising global energy prices tied to this conflict, the Trump administration has allowed limited flexibility in sanctions enforcement on Russian oil to try to stabilize markets. That may help the world in the short term, but Russia stands to benefit significantly financially during this conflict. So when you step back, Russia's positioned to gain strategically by dividing U.S. focus, militarily by tying down U.S. assets, and economically through the energy markets that were previously restricted, which raises a critical question. How is the U.S. planning to account for that? Because if Iran can regenerate capability, and if external actors, Russia, can continue to support or enable that, then this risks becoming a prolonged conflict. So again, where does this go? If the administration does not intend to put ground forces into Iran, then it needs to explain what success looks like without them. If it believes regime collapse requires action on the ground, then it needs to say that clearly. And if the plan continues to be strikes over time, then the American people need to understand that this may not be short. Because we'll figure out as we go is not a strategy. Not against a country this large, and not against an Iranian government that is this entrenched in the lives of the Iranian nation, and not with American servicemen and women already in harm's way. Tonight, we walk through some difficult questions questions about war, about leadership, about the responsibility of Congress and the president, and most importantly, about the responsibility a nation bears when its sons and daughters are once again in harm's way. These decisions should never be made lightly. Behind every military operation are young Americans standing watch on ships, airfields, and bases all around the region. People volunteered to defend this country, trusting that their leaders would send them into danger only when the cause is clear and the purpose is worthy. So let's be direct. And I want to make it clear, reasonable people can agree and disagree on this war. The president has an obligation in this moment. He needs to sit down and level with the American people. He needs to explain clearly why this war is necessary, why it happened to happen now. What are the actual goals? What does success look like? What are the risks that remain? And what sacrifices may be required from the American people at home and from American forces abroad? Because these explanations have not been constant. I don't have TDS. I've been watching the news very frequently, both liberal, conservative, foreign. I've watched these news conferences. It's something different every day. At the time, the language has been about negotiation. At other times, it's been about unconditional surrender. Other times, talking about regime change, and other times, maybe discussing with the current regime. Those aren't the same objectives. A nation cannot fight a war if it does not understand what it's fighting for. And if the goal is changing, then American people deserve to know it. And if the goal is not changing, the administration needs to say plainly what it is. President Trump has time to campaign. If he has time to attack political opponents on the campaign trail, then he has time to speak honestly to the country about war. If he has time to tweet about it, he has time to sit there and take some time on primetime TV and explain it. Some might say it's already too late for President Trump to sit down and lay out the reasoning for going to war, the goals and the objectives and the costs. I argue it's not too late. The war is still being fought at home here as far as in the matter of public opinion. The battlefront and the home front are just as critical. While we were winning wars and winning the battles in Vietnam, we were losing the war at home in Vietnam. It's one thing to launch missiles and aircraft into hostile territory and have servicemen and women operating outside or over Iran. It becomes a much more serious and much more personal to the American people when you have boots on the ground. So if that's the eventual goal, President Trump really needs to sit down with the American people. Again, there's no evidence as of yet that troops on the ground is the plan, just a possibility, possible option on the table with the 31st Marine Expedition Force and 3 amphibious ships heading into that theater operations. And Congress has its own duty. Congress needs to stop playing partisan games while the Americans are in harm's way. Republicans should not blindly follow the president simply because he is a Republican. If their states and districts oppose further escalation, then they are duty bound to represent the people who sent them there. And Democrats should not oppose military action simply because Donald Trump is the one ordering it, nor should they treat wartime failure as a political opportunity. In regards to the DHS shutdown and TSA, the adults need to enter the conversation. Republicans and Democrats fighting over issues of homeland security in a time of war and letting it last this long, 3 weeks into a war, is grossly irresponsible. I'll add Democrats must also represent their constituents' wishes and not their party strategy. When Americans are at war, members of Congress do not exist to perform for cable news, posture for the primaries, or protect party branding. They exist to exercise judgment and oversight, to debate, demand answers, to vote, conduct oversight, and take responsibility. That responsibility matters because Congress does not get to wash its hands of past failures. Vietnam and Afghanistan was not only the failure of presidents and senior military leadership, those failures also belong in part to Congress, to the members that funded, authorized, delayed, looked away, stayed silent, or chose party over duty. So if members of Congress continue to ignore their constitutional role, they continue to filter war through partisan loyalty instead of national responsibility, then they're doing an injustice to the American people and to every American service man and woman placed in harm's way. And frankly, those who cannot rise above partisan politics when the country is at war are not fit to remain in office. The American people deserve honesty from their leaders. They deserve clarity about why we fight, what victory means, and what sacrifices may be required. That means that might mean higher prices at the pump, higher cost in groceries, and economic pressures that families will feel. They also deserve honesty about something else. War's not perfect. Mistakes will happen. In fact, mistakes have already happened. Not every plan works out the way it's drawn up. There are moments in war when confusion sets in, when information is incomplete, where decisions are made in seconds that carry enormous consequences. That's why the phrases exist like the fog of war, unintended consequences, collateral damage, friendly fire. They're not just words, they're realities of conflict. And sometimes those realities mean the loss of American servicemen and women, innocent civilians like the 160 to 180 school children killed in Manab, Iran, and outcomes that nobody intends. And to the American people, many of which have been fortunate enough to have never experienced combat or lived in war zones. Terrible things like what happened in Manab, Iran, school bombing, are unfortunate and frequent symptom of war, and in most cases are not done because of malice. But the reality does not remove responsibility. It increases it because when mistakes happen, Leaders should not be coy, deflective, or deceitful. Own the mistake. Be honest. Be accountable and transparent because the truth comes out eventually. And in today's world, if it often comes out pretty quickly. Be accountable up front, even when the truth is difficult. It's going to build trust in the long term than being deceptive, deflective, or trying to cover it up. No partisan games, no shifting explanations, no political convenience, but truth. Because if we're going to ask Americans to fight, we owe them the truth about why. Because when leaders are not honest, when the explanation shifts, when trust is broken, something far more dangerous begins to erode the trust between a government and its people. And history is clear what happens when that trust collapses. During the Vietnam War, confidence in the government shattered after years of conflicting statements and revelations that were made, like in the Pentagon Papers. And the years of the Soviet Union, citizens lost faith in the state's ability to tell the truth, manage the economy, and provide stability. This system collapsed. And in the Arab Spring, longstanding distrust in leadership, combined with economic strain, sparked uprisings across multiple countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa, some of which have still not recovered. When people stop believing their government, they stop trusting its decisions. They stop supporting its missions. And eventually, they stop sacrificing for it. That matters. Because one day, this country may face a crisis far greater than the one in front of us now. And it could be an economic collapse, depression, a global war much bigger than what we're in right now, a moment that demands unity, sacrifice, and resolve. And if that day comes and the American people no longer trust their leaders, then the cost of that lost trust will be far greater than anything we have ever faced. That is why honesty matters, not just for this war, but the future of the Republic itself. Thank you for joining me tonight. Please keep our servicemen and women in your prayers and pray for our leaders in D.C. to have wisdom, clarity, and courage to do what's right. Until our next conversation, I'm Jeremiah Ridge, and this has been the American Reckoning Podcast, where faith leads, history speaks, and truth and light will endure.